Well, welcome y'all. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Kara Cooper. I coordinate the Kentucky Just Transition Coalition. And tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about climate resiliency and mutual aid. Please feel free to drop your name and where you're calling in from into the chat, as well as any questions you have, or feel free to come off mute if you're on Zoom and share your questions that way. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about who the Kentucky Just Transition Coalition is. We are a cross-sector organization. We're bringing together environmental justice organizations, racial, economic, and social justice organizations, and labor to fight for policies and elected officials who will support good jobs, climate justice, and care. Our current members include Rubbertown Emergency Action Team, the Kentucky Student Environmental Coalition, Hood to the Holler, SEIU, the IUECWA, and Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. So what is climate resiliency? I'd love to actually have people come off mute if you want to and just kind of chime in around, when you hear the word resiliency, what does that mean to you? Or what do you think climate resiliency means?
Having a plan for dealing with the outcomes of worse storms or more frequent droughts, heavier rains, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Does anything else come to mind for folks when you hear the word resiliency?
Faster recovery from any type of climate disaster, whatever that might be, and having services in place to make that recovery fast and simple.
Yeah, I mean, you all nailed it, right? It's about the ability to be prepared for ahead of time climate-related disasters, and also be ready to recover from and adapt after climate-related impacts happen. And when I think about climate resiliency, I really think about it coming from a combination of community level systems of support. So things like mutual aid networks, things like energy democracy, so people actively shaping the transition of our energy system, in addition to public policy that gives communities and local governments the tools needed to prepare for and respond to climate-related harms. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these things as we go. But I want to just kind of start with thinking about, like, what does climate change look like in Kentucky? And when it comes to the climate predictions for Kentucky, the research shows that Kentucky is a fairly good place to be in relation to climate-related weather changes. So as a result of that, we can and should expect an influx of population as coastal cities and areas with more wildfire risks move inward and north. And so that's a whole nother conversation that communities need to be having in terms of climate migration and what does that mean to have an influx of population, and how does that potentially change the fabric of our communities or increase things like gentrification. But it's not going to be all smooth sailing. And you can use a website called riskfactor.com and actually model how weather patterns related to fire, heat, and flooding might change for your area. So you can actually put in your zip code and it'll give you those 3 ratings. So it's pretty interesting. And so I went ahead and used risk factor to look at the state of Kentucky. And what we're most at risk for is increased flooding and heat-related events, which we're already seeing, right? So in terms of flooding, so this is the change, we're going to first talk about the change in extreme rain events compared to 1980 to 2010 average. So this first map is this year. So you can see that we're already having some extreme rain events this year. The idea that climate change is coming in the future is no longer something we can hope for, right? It's here. And then we can watch how this map changes as we look at 15 years, and then we look at 30 years. And so as you can see, we're going to see more extreme rain events happening all across basically the entire state over the next 30 years. So what does that mean? It means more frequent and more severe flooding events, which we're already seeing, right? And it means that people who live in floodplains or manufactured homes, the elderly, poor folks, and folks with limited mobility are most at risk. So, what can we do about it? First thing we can do about it is ensure that the natural environment is ready to help mitigate extreme weather. So that means restoring our streams and waterways that are natural ways of moving water, planting vegetation that helps to catch storm runoff, things like that. It also means increasing building standards so that our buildings are more able to withstand flooding events, potentially raising buildings higher. Some folks are even looking into like alternative building materials that are quick dry. And it means increasing local programs and partnerships so that we are prepared ahead of time. So early warning systems when possible, making sure folks know when and where and how to get to shelters, having partnerships in place ahead of time for how different agencies and local organizations can work together. So those are all some of the kind of first steps for increasing resiliency around flooding. And so you can kind of see this laid out, is that there are community risk reducers and there are individual risk reducers. So zoning where possible, levees and flood walls, natural storage, increased building codes, evacuation plan, and risk communication. And then at the individual level, where possible, flood proofing and insurance can help reduce the risk. The next thing.
In for a second.
Sure.
So when you talk about the idea of increasing building standards, excuse me, I'm sorry. I think it's also going to be important to note that we also need to go back and retrofit or fortify existing structures, such as individual houses. There's a lot of houses in our city that have basements that flood.
Yeah.
And so these increased rain events are going to increase folks' chances of their basements flooding, which increases the chance of the deterioration of their homes and increased exposure to mold and mildew. And so when we're thinking about increasing building standards, we actually need to keep in mind existing structures and determine what ways we can divert rainwaters away from houses. So we need to have a plan for, as much as possible, how to get the rain waters diverted and, sump pumps, things of that nature, backup batteries and all of that. So I want to make sure that we take care of the folks who, already exist instead of just new standards for buildings.
No, that's an excellent point, right? And we've got a lot of older buildings, a lot of older homes. And so being able to, put policies in place to help folks to retrofit is going to be incredibly important. And folks, feel free to come off mute and weigh in with your ideas and your thoughts and things too as we go. Is there anything other folks want to weigh in about flooding before we move into extreme heat?
Just to follow up quickly on that really important comment is that Kentucky does have a minimum standard of building codes that have to be enforced. Many counties don't have a building code enforcement person. So that, in many cases, they're almost non-existent, but they're also really outdated, and local cities don't have the authority to adopt stronger building codes. Even if Louisville wanted to or Hazard, Kentucky wanted to, they're not by law allowed to adopt building codes that are stronger than the minimum. So that's a policy issue that we'll need to contend.
Thanks, y'all.
Our
Yeah, and
current
as
building,
we're going through this, I think we're gonna, we're gonna kind of cover the basics, but we have our work cut out for us as per usual, right? In terms of getting resiliency where it needs to go.
and our current Kentucky building codes are more than a decade old.
I promise it's not going to be all doom and gloom, y'all, but first we got to get through the kind of doom and gloom part. And so extreme heat is the other big thing that we're going to be facing in Kentucky. And so this map is showing this year. It's looking at it's looking at what they've defined as like a hot day temperature. So hot days, quote unquote, in Kentucky are days that fall between 96 degrees and 110 degrees. And so this map is showing the number of days that are falling into this category of hot days, right? And so you can see this year, the number of hot days, and we did have, heat events this year. And then you can see on the next slide what this looks like in 30 years. So we're seeing a lot more extreme heat, a lot more hot days in the next 30 years. So what does this mean? It means more frequent and more severe heat events, including heat waves, which are 3+ hot days in a row, health caution days, and dangerous days. People who live in cities or places with lots of concrete, houseless people, young people, the elderly. Experience the greatest increase in heat wave likelihood are Marshall County, Lyon County, and Callaway County. And so this is another big threat. Again, there are things we can do ahead of time to prepare. Things like energy efficiency and shading our homes, creating homes that are not leaking out air conditioning. They'll stay cooler longer. If we do lose power, they'll help make it so your air conditioner doesn't have to work as hard if you have an air conditioner to cool your home. Public education around signs and symptoms of heat-related illness, so how to recognize and avoid heat-related illness. And then community safety, so providing shady areas in our communities, public cooling stations where folks can have access to water and air conditioning, establishing hotlines and warning systems to let people know or to let the community know when they need help, and then working to protect our energy and water systems from these extreme heat events. And I know I live in Lexington during our heat wave. They made like our public pools free during the event. So being able to do things like that, offering people cool places to be with access to water is one thing communities can do.
And then I just want to step in just here and talk about those people who can't go to these community spaces but are homebound. I have a brother who has had a heart and kidney transplant, so he doesn't get out much. And so when I think about him, I think about, power issues and whether or not maybe there could be some way. Now, bear with me because I don't know much about solar, but if right now they have like room air conditioners, not the window kind, but the stand-up room air conditioning. And I often wonder, is there a solar battery that can handle the wattage from that? Where people who are elderly or, very ill could at least confine themselves to one room, have one of these air conditioning units with a solar battery. And just thinking of some solutions like that. That's just what I've been thinking about for him.
Yeah.
And so thinking about solutions also for those people who can't make it to these spaces, you know, like the public cooling station.
Yeah, and I do know that there are like solar powered generators that exist, and folks who have rooftop solar, you know, are insulated against the brownouts because they can provide their own electricity. And so thinking about programs to help folks get more rooftop solar or access solar generators, I think is a great thing to be thinking about in terms of making sure folks that are homebound are not left in their hot homes as these heat events increase. Folks have other thoughts about
Daisy?
Yeah, I was gonna say I also want to like uplift just on the note of like the hotlines and like the warning systems and also kind of like touching on like just like accessibility for people that like have like disabilities and stuff like that. There's like a I don't know, trying to find some analog ways to get these warnings out, a lot of this like information out. Like, I think that it's really great that we're all like, in terms of like building climate resiliency, like finding a way to like get, you know, information out to people, like let people know like what is going on. But I mean, a lot of it is digitized. And I think that we're learning that, you know, our infrastructure can't hold a lot of like the natural disasters that are happening, and those recovery times are starting to be a lot more slower. And so I think just something to keep in mind, that if we're gonna establish more of these like community like warning systems, to really think about the accessibility of that, like who we are accessing, who has certain resources and who doesn't, and also like disabilities as well. So
yeah, thank you for adding that.
And just to chime in just once more, with regard to, you know, both the rain events and the heat events, those folks who are living near dangerous, hazardous industries, there definitely needs to be policy around, what do you say, the chemical facilities, and making sure that they do inventory of their backup systems. What I found over the years in dealing with the chemical facilities in Rubbertown is that a lot of their backup systems are inferior to their regular normal systems. And that's problematic, because that means that if they have to go to backup, there's going to be increased pollution events. Additionally, some years back, more than a decade ago, there was a storm in Louisville. Zeon Chemicals, their power ran out, and there was a hydrochloric acid spill as a result of that, because their backup generator or whatever they had wasn't sufficient or didn't work. I can't remember the details, but there was a hydrochloric acid cloud over the neighborhood for some time that they couldn't just put water on. And so, you know, we need to be making sure that the strategy is multi-pronged, that we're dealing with household level stuff for mitigation, and we're also dealing with policy concerning these very hazardous chemical facilities.
Thank you for that. So the last weather event I wanted to talk about, because I feel like it's still really fresh on everyone's minds, is tornadoes, with the Western Kentucky tornado relief still very much happening. And what the research is showing about tornadoes and climate change is that there's not necessarily evidence that there will be more tornadoes, but we're definitely seeing changing patterns in tornadoes. So seeing many more clustered tornado events. So days where there are like 30 tornadoes in one day happening. And we're seeing that tornado patterns are moving into states outside of what's traditionally known as Tornado Alley. So more tornadoes in Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And so what does it mean? It means we may see more powerful tornadoes, and we may see tornadoes impacting areas that aren't usually impacted. Houseless folks, people without access to transportation, rural communities, people who live in manufactured or older homes are all at higher risk. And some of the things that we can do here, again, are increasing building standards, retrofitting existing homes to meet those standards, ensuring community emergency plans are in place, including early warning and emergency warning systems, transportation to shelters to help folks get to safe places, and again, increasing local programs and partnerships. So things like building local storm shelters and cellars under community buildings, and ensuring response teams have plans in place to work across organizations and local government. And what we're seeing, I think, really highlighted even just in this conversation that we're having right now, is that it's so important that community members are a part of having these conversations around what we need to do to increase resiliency and what we need to do to have better disaster response, because we're the folks who are living these lives and having to think about how to navigate all of these different pieces of how this actually gets put into place and how it actually plays out in the case of a disaster. And so, as per usual, making sure that community members are leading these conversations is incredibly important when it comes to climate resiliency. Other things folks want to weigh in around tornadoes?
I'll add that Whitney put in the chat that in Western Kentucky's case, stronger protections for workers is also important in this big picture here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and based on the comment that we just had from Ebony too around chemical facility workers, I think across the board we need stronger protections for workers and related to these types of disasters. Thank you, Whitney, for that. So I want to just talk really briefly about mitigating the impacts of climate change, and then we'll talk about, we'll kind of get into the disaster response piece. So mitigating the impacts of climate change, while climate change is here, it is not too late to do something to stop the worst impacts of climate change. It is not all lost. There are plenty of things that need to happen and can happen still. The recently passed Inflation Reduction Act has the potential to get us part of the way there. Analysis is saying that it can put us on a path to reach 40% reductions by 2030. But the IRA is an incentives-based federal funding package, and we're going to really need to push local and state governments as well as utilities to take full advantage of it. But we have to push for more. That's not enough. 40% reductions by 2030 is not enough. We need 100% reductions by 2050 is what the science is saying. And so that means that we need to get involved in the local energy democracy movement, holding utilities accountable for moving quickly to truly clean and renewable energy sources, and increasing energy efficiency programs. We need to elect candidates who will act on the state and local level, enacting clean energy and climate resiliency policies. And I'm sure that there are folks on this call who have 100 other ideas of ways that we can really start to put policies in place to curb our carbon emissions and get us where we need to go to stop the worst impacts of climate change. So happy to pause here and let other folks chime in if anything's coming to mind for you around what we need to do.
So just real quick, I think that we need to figure out how to, and we're doing that, how to identify the threats, but also how to coordinate our efforts among our varying organizations so that work is done simultaneously. So while we're doing the policy piece, which tends to take much longer, we also need to be doing these, smaller pieces like household by household type things, where we're educating people on, what's happening, what some of the solutions are and how we get to those solutions, and then coordinating efforts between organizations to help, individual households get what they need. And yeah, it sounds easy. Well, no, it doesn't sound easy. But
It
we need to.
sounds simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah, okay, that's a good one. But it has to be done. I mean, we
Yeah.
can't just, work on policy piece and then leave all of the vulnerable people, all of us, just sitting here waiting for the policy to be passed, to be overturned, to be pushed back, and not have our own life jackets or whatever we need in order to weather these storms that are here and that are coming. So I hope that we can really, excuse me, work on getting some concrete plan together for us, because really, like, some of us need to be going to the I think it's the LEPC, but the emergency management folks, we need to be understanding what their plan is, what is their role in the event of some of these crises. We need to be understanding evacuation plans. There's plenty of people who will be left behind in these neighborhoods that don't have a car, that are just left here. Is there some sort of mass transportation? So we need to be thinking about these things rather quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to your point too about needing to go, door to door and take care of what we can take care of on our own. The Inflation Reduction Act has all sorts of incentives for individuals as well, but it's really going to be up to us to learn how those programs work, to educate people on them and make sure they're implemented in our communities as well. So, other folks have stuff you want to chime in with?
I think that, again, you have to work across multiple layers of responsibility. And we may want to try to fall back on what they used to have back in the 50s and 60s with the civilian corps that was prepared for any disaster response. We may want to work with ham radio clubs to make sure that we have emergency communications set up. In this day and age, everybody relies on their phones and assumes the cell towers are going to be just fine, and that's a false assumption. So there are multiple ways, and some of it may be going back to what has worked in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I have family in Southwest Florida and saw firsthand that the cell towers don't always work in an emergency, right? And it's terrifying to not be able to get a hold of the people that you love and check on them, and even more terrifying for folks who can't get a hold of the help that they need because they can't get their cell phones to work. So absolutely. Other folks want to chime in before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm just getting real happy with this combo. I think the only thing I wanted to say is, like, there's a lot of things that we could be doing now. I think that this is, like, really a time to, like, get creative and, like, use the resources that we have. There's plenty of things that we don't even need to get done through policy. I think that this is, like, very much, like, for our survival and, like, for generations later on to, like, live on. And so I don't know, it's just nice to dream up these ways that we can move forward. I don't know, I get giggity.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm thinking, like, there's a lot of content in this 1 hour, but I'd love to schedule a time to just have conversation too. So if folks are jazzed about continuing to have this conversation, to dream and brainstorm, like, let's set up a time and just talk about it. Because there's a lot to talk about and a lot to do. So we're talk just a little bit about disaster response, and a little bit about mutual aid, because it's so important. So, federal, state, and local disaster response is absolutely necessary, but we all know it often doesn't do enough, and it doesn't stay in place long enough. Rebuilding after disaster is long-term work, and disaster relief is really built to meet short-term needs. And that's where mutual aid can be so helpful and so important. So what is mutual aid? Mutual aid is simply when everyday people join together to meet the needs of our communities, recognizing that the system is not working for us. And it's important to note that mutual aid is not charity, not the same thing. Charity is a framework that often means rich people giving a little bit to poor people. A lot of times there are strings attached around what gets given and who it gets given to. So, giving to mothers, giving to children, and it means that oftentimes charity is a strategy for controlling poor people. Mutual aid is solidarity, and it's really designed to meet everyone's needs. And mutual aid societies have been around forever. So we've seen a huge uptick in mutual aid networks kind of with the beginning of the pandemic, but mutual aid societies have been around forever, and they're very prevalent in Latinx and Black communities, especially. Like, for example, mutual aid societies have started in the United States in the 17 and 1800s as a way for African American and Black communities to pool resources to help folks out when they're sick and they can't work, to help with funeral costs, to help support widows and orphans. And then there's another long-standing tradition in Mexican culture around creating tandas, which is a rotating loan fund. So community members pool resources and create a rotating loan fund for families. And every month or every so often, a family gets the lump of money so that they can take care of a large expense. And then they pay it back and pay it forward. There's just a couple examples of ways that mutual aid networks have been happening and are happening all over the world. Here's some pictures of some mutual aid stuff related to the Eastern Kentucky flooding that's happened. Just thought it'd be nice to see some pictures and less words for a second. And I just want to just talk a little bit about Eastern Kentucky Mutual Aid because it's been so vital in the flood response. EKY Mutual Aid has been able to move massive resources, and they do it without means testing, they do it without red tape, they do it without bureaucracy in a way that's reaching folks who might otherwise be considered hard to help or left behind. Folks who maybe don't have a bank account, folks who don't have access to internet or transportation. And it's in no small part because they had an existing network of support, care, and trust before the disaster hit. So when we talk about like going door to door and making sure people are right, that's what mutual aid networks are doing. Eastern Kentucky Mutual Aid has been really helping to shape through collaboration how local funders, institutions, and nonprofits have been able to move resources in a way that's truly community led. And so we're seeing that with a mutual aid network in place and good collaboration happening, we can move money from some of these more traditional institutions that may have been moving money to like Red Cross or something like that, actually moving tons of money directly to people who need it by utilizing the local mutual aid networks. Here's the link for the PayPal. The need is very much ongoing, and so folks should think about, if you can, moving some money to Eastern Kentucky Mutual Aid. And I'll pause because I'm sure there are lots of folks on this call that can say more about mutual aid and the work that Eastern Kentucky Mutual Aid's been doing as well.
Hey, it's me again talking. Okay. Yeah, no, I want to just talk about like mutual aid and how these societies have cropped up like over the centuries for like marginalized communities to make it through rough times. I think that's like one way of really looking at it, but like to really kind of like encompass it all together. Like this is really like just a natural way of being with one another, and should really like show like how far we have divested from being that way with each other, and how it's just interesting how you just said like all the resources go towards like super huge like agencies like the Red Cross, when you could just simply like put it in the hands of those people that need it. And like as like a mutual aid practitioner, I guess that I could like say that now. It's like weird. It's like, you know, like it's just like seeing what it does for people like on the daily, like it is really like true human soul work, and encourage everyone, not even like within disaster times, because it's another thing, like we wait for a crisis to come and then we act in this way with one another. Like we should be like this with one another every day, so that it is, you know, when stuff really does hit the fan, like it's not going to be hard to do, you know, it's not going to be like a what's the word for it, a hassle, you know. And so yeah, shout out to Eastern Kentucky Mutual Aid. I haven't made it out to Eastern Kentucky at all because I'm like homebound. But like it's just crazy because it's like all the damage feels like so far away and it's really so close. And I live in Bowling Green and we went through the tornado here. Like I literally live on the street that it happened on and I see the damage every day. So it's just, I don't know. I just want to uplift the soul work that is truly mutual aid. And I'm really glad that like there's this wave happening of us being like, oh, like let's do this. Like let's do this.
And I think one of the questions I would have is, like you said, you don't want to just do this during disasters. So what support do mutual aid organizations need in order to consistently build that trust and that name recognition when there aren't disasters happening?
And I was going to say, to add to that, I feel like, you know, shifting how we function in a way where like we have these support networks where like also people aren't just having to do this work like on the side, right? Like a lot of the people that are doing this mutual aid work like have also been hit by these floods, have also been hit by these tornadoes, like also have jobs, also have lives. And so like to have these support networks invested in where like people don't have to be like doing this on the side where they're already dealing with all this other stuff. Like, I think that is such an important thing to be investing in now, so that burnout also doesn't happen. Because I think that that's what we're seeing with a lot of this is like, there's so much to do, and only so many people like on the ground that are able to assist. And yeah, if we can build that in now, I think that like that's really important. I was also going to say, kind of like on this note of these like large organizations, I was just talking with someone who worked with FEMA for a little while, and how, you know, like what Daisy was saying, shifting almost like the cultural aspect to it, where like we're seeing people more as people and not just like numbers, which I think is often what happens with these like big organizations, is like all of these people that need help are just numbers on a sheet. And that's why there's less compassion, I think, like with these processes that are like, we need to see your ID, we need to see your deed, we need you to like explain yourself away of why you need support, when like support is so obviously needed. And honestly doesn't make sense, in my opinion, for like how long these agencies have been doing this work of like, of course I don't have my ID, of course I don't have my deed, I don't know where my house is that those things are in, you know. And so yeah, just reinvesting and shifting that, both like within these agencies, but also like on this cultural level and like how we treat people. Just because, yeah, I really, really appreciate that you brought that up, DZ, because I think it's so important.
And I also really appreciated, you know, the thought that like this is the way humans have been together for most of our existence. Like, this is a normal way for us to interact with each other, and this like mentality of individualism and like taking care of yourself and your like family unit is relatively new in our timeline, right? And so we just have to flex these muscles and this like muscle memory that we have you know, in our evolution to rebuild these ways of being together. I appreciate all of that, y'all. Does anybody else want to say anything before we move on?
I just would say to the, I'm not sure who spoke a couple people ago, but East Kentucky Mutual Aid really got cranking during the pandemic. And the fact that that network of trust and care and that community existed meant that when the flood disaster hit, on top of the pandemic disaster, on top of the just long-term economic disaster that people live with, they were really rooted and ready and had relationships of volunteers, et cetera. So the day in, day out building of those networks is really part of the quote unquote infrastructure that our communities need.
Thanks for that. All right. So I wanted to just highlight, you know, I mean, based on all the conversation we've already been having, right, we know that recovery is not necessarily going to be a just recovery. And so I wanted to highlight some of these just recovery principles that the Climate Justice Alliance uses to root recovery work in justice. So the first is right to return. So it's around protecting the rights of climate migrants and climate refugees who settle in new communities while providing a right to return to lands that remain livable, and or providing full and fair compensation for losses. So for example, Alaska Native villages, which are facing legal, political, cultural, economic factors complicating government funding for finding new lands and relocating due to climate-related changes. Community governance of restoration practices, so supporting restoration through community governance and care, prioritizing Indigenous and rural communities that are impacted by climate disasters. I mean, that's some of what we've been talking about tonight too, right? That like community really needs to be a part of making the decisions on how this work is done. It needs to be rooted in care. Fair housing recovery. And so this is around fixing discriminatory inequities in disaster housing assistance and long-term housing recovery, you know, changing federal standards and rules and procedures around prioritizing low-income homeowners, renters, and unhoused people in allocation of housing aid and recovery resources, and with a particular focus on long-term housing recovery programs. I mean, these disasters they're heartbreaking and they're heart-wrenching, and they're also an opportunity for us to do things differently and to codify those different ways of doing things and new standards and rules. Investing in community hubs, so moving resources to build out local infrastructure and community hubs powered by renewable energy to meet the needs of disaster impacted communities, being able to offer broadband and shelter and heat and cooling, electricity, food, water, medicine, communication, and everything people need in times of crisis. Investing funds in mutual aid collectives. Like we just talked about, community initiatives are more effective and impactful in dispersing funds, supplies, and counseling support compared to national nonprofits. Funding needs to be made available to staff local mutual aid networks, and these centers should be prioritized for disaster and federal funding support so that resources are moved in local and accountable ways. and just and equitable recovery funding. So increasing funding and resources to support community-driven recovery and mid to long-term rebuilding and implementation projects that are really focused on adaptation, recovery, and rebuilding with local control, administering disaster insurance programs, such as the National Flood Insurance Program, rather than private companies controlling these resources, services, and processes. So a lot of what we've been talking about when asking the question around how do we do this in a way that's just, there is a framework that we can look to. So we're almost out of time. I might just breeze through this piece a bit, and if folks are interested, set up a follow-up conversation where we can talk more as a group and I can talk less. But like I said, there are opportunities when rebuilding to rebuild in a way that's better, in a way that's stronger. And so there are some amazing opportunities within the Inflation Reduction Act that we can look at in terms of rebuilding post Western Kentucky tornadoes, rebuilding post Eastern Kentucky flooding, ways that make rebuilding in a way that's energy efficient and powered by renewable energy not only affordable but cheap, makes it so it's a no-brainer that we rebuild in those ways that we need to be moving anyway. Federal funding has not always reached communities who need it most, but the IRA may be the first federal funding policy that's truly aiming to center justice in its implementation, including things like funding that is specifically earmarked to reach rural communities, funding multipliers for projects located in environmental justice, low income and coal impacted communities, among other things. But we're really going to have to be creative in how we stack these incentives together. And we're really going to have to hold utilities and government accountable for using the funding in the way that is intended. A couple of quick examples. So, for example, there will be funding coming in from HUD for rebuilding houses. That funding can be layered with the Inflation Reduction Act's $8,000 in tax credits for energy efficiency and combined with a 30% rebate on rooftop solar to really pay for some of these things through HUD funding and take advantage of the IRA incentives. And then when you add in the benefit multipliers for projects that are located in low-income communities, it just doesn't make sense to rebuild in a way that's not taking advantage of these incentives. There's the 30% solar rebate that can also be combined with USDA REAP grants for agriculture and small businesses. Those REAP grants can cover 50% of a solar installation, which would make installing renewables incredibly affordable. And then there is already infrastructure in place with some of our rural electric co-ops around our How Smart Kentucky program, which is an on-bill financing program for energy efficiency upgrades. So essentially there are some co-ops that will fund upfront your energy efficiency upgrades, and then you pay it back through your savings over time. We could see co-ops taking on responsibility of helping customers to navigate IRA incentives, providing the financing upfront and being paid back through the tax credits and monthly savings that customers see after implementation. But collaboration amongst all of the organizations that are working on these issues, amongst all of the programs and agencies of how these are going to be administered, and accountability are going to be really, really key, right? We can't trust that the government will do this for us. We can't trust that our utilities will do the right thing. We're going to have to hold them accountable to doing so. I'll pause for a second and just see if there's anything anybody wants to add here before we wrap up and take more questions and discussion.
I think as it relates to mutual aid, we also need to, I think it'd be good to focus also on skills building, like literally around how to rebuild, how to do some of the things that need to be done around the house, and having teams of folks who can do that for people who are unable to afford, certain repairs and things. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that idea. I mean, to the fullest extent possible, we need to figure out what we can do for ourselves, and we need to do it for ourselves, right? We can't wait. Anybody else want to add anything?
I had a question. I know that Kentuckians for Energy Democracy was working around the integrated resource plan for LG&E and kind of like how these utility companies are planning for the future or really aren't currently. And so I was kind of curious if there's like still opportunities for like input on that, or like if that IRP did go through or not.
Yeah, so every 3 years, our rural electric co-ops and our investor-owned electric utilities in Kentucky have to submit a 15-year plan called an integrated resource plan to the Public Service Commission to be reviewed and commented on. In Kentucky, there's actually no teeth in terms of making the utility do what they've said they're going to do in their plan. So even if a utility came out with a really good plan, there's no way of us enforcing that they actually do it. And utilities are not coming up with really great plans. They're very content, for the most part, with business as usual. And so in terms of the most recent LG&E and KU integrated resource plan, that process is complete. And you can read the staff report on it on the Public Service Commission's website. But there will be an opportunity again for LG&E and KU folks in 3 years to weigh in on the next plan. And we're in the process right now of East Kentucky Power Cooperative's integrated resource plan. So there will be an opportunity for public comment around that. Kentucky Power will go next, and then they kind of cycle through. And so depending on who your electric provider is, there will be opportunities to weigh in on their next 15-year plan, kind of ongoing. Did that answer your question, Kat?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that's disappointing of like, even when, you do have people engaged in the process and trying to shape that it's like, yeah, they still don't do anything.
Yeah, yes, but we are seeing like with the LG&E KU integrated resource plan, there was more public comment than there's ever been. And that really shaped the conversation at the Public Service Commission in terms of the questions that the Public Service Commission was asking of the utilities, of things that they're asking them to do next time. And there was a lot of kind of whining on the part of the utilities of like, we've never had to do this before. We've never had to actually come up with a plan before. So it is helpful. It is working. And we can continue to put pressure on the Public Service Commission to hold utilities accountable in the places where there are more teeth around like rate cases and things like that are actually more enforceable.
So Kara, you mentioned cooperation and collaboration, and that takes a lot of time and effort, like this call, to reach out, make those kind of connections and form those relationships. Relationships are everything when it comes to this kind of work, I believe. I just wanted to make sure that as you reach out, you think of groups that you might not normally reach out to. Hospitals, because energy consistency is extremely important for them. That might be a way to reach some of the business level people as well. And libraries are always a great collaborator. And then find a way to reach the public school children, because that's the future.
Yeah.
And now the name just went out of my head. Like master gardeners and people like that, because you mentioned for flooding, especially, to change how we use nature to help ameliorate some of the effects. And so there are organizations that are already promoting that.
Yeah, I love all those ideas. Thank you. I just wanted to really quickly say like something about moving beyond resiliency. I think when I think of the word resiliency, I think about being tough and bouncing back. But I want to live in a world where we don't have to be tough and we don't have to bounce back. And so resiliency is important, but we need to also be thinking about how do we move beyond resiliency. The Kentucky Just Transition Coalition is really working for a world where people make a living wage and they have good, safe, everyone has a good, safe job that they can do to meet their basic needs, and a world where we're fixing some of the problems with the system that's in place so that we don't need to have mutual aid networks helping people pay their electric bill or helping folks put gas in their gas tank to get to work, right? I mean, I imagine a world where mutual aid exists to help people, to find childcare or to, get a bowl of soup when they're sick, right? To borrow a cup of sugar. That's the world that we're really working towards building, one where we don't have to continually be resilient. There are some great ways for you to get involved. I'm going to just drop them here quick. So give to Eastern Kentucky Mutual Aid. The Kentucky Student Environmental Coalition has a mutual aid working group that you can join. If you're in Louisville, you can join KFTC's Energy Justice Working Group. You can follow Kentucky Just Transition Coalition on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And come to our next workshop, which is going to be on November 15th around climate and environmental justice. And yeah, I would love to follow up with folks and to schedule a time to talk more about climate resiliency and mutual aid and how we get there. That's more of a discussion and less of a presentation. So yeah, stay tuned for information on how to get involved with that. Thanks y'all so much for being here.